Welcome to Through the Trauma podcast. My name is Amber Larkins, published photographer, storytelling expert, visual artist, entrepreneur, speaker, and coach. This podcast was born from one question: how do I get inspiring stories of triumph out to the people who need to hear them the most? Come with me, enter my world, where lives are getting changed, heroes are getting developed, and greatness is being achieved. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Through the Trauma podcast. I am Amber Larkins, your host, and today I have with me Dr. Don St. John. He is a psychotherapist, an author, and a continuum teacher. He's going to explain to us what that is, but he's done some really amazing work and healing people from trauma and working with people who have trauma. So I'm really excited to get into his story, learn a little bit more about him and about his work and what he does and how he can inspire us today. So Dr. Don, thank you for being here today. It's so nice to have you.
Delighted to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation, Amber.
I am too. I am really excited to have you here. I know when your assistant reached out to me and I did a little bit of research on you, and I thought this is someone I have to have come on the podcast and share your expertise with us. I would love to get into, we'll just kind of jump right into things. I would love for you to maybe share with us kind of what has moved you and led you into this line of work.
It also is a long story. I had significant traumatic experiences in my childhood. I almost died at birth, and my mother says it was a miraculous save by a very skilled obstetrician. And then I somewhat facetiously say it got worse from there for the next 15 years or so, because my mother, who had a great heart, but she would lose it and get pretty violent. She'd swing and slap, and it began when I was an infant, and it continued until I was, large enough to physically say no more. And my father was characterized mostly by his emotional, psychological absence and snarky attitude towards me than pretty much anything else. And so the short of it, Amber, is that I was a frozen character, meaning I had very little awareness below my head. Very little access to my feelings, to my heart, just to bodily sensations. And, I didn't know there was anything wrong until I was about 22 years old, when one morning I realized I need help. I was broken up with my high school sweetheart, drinking heavily, getting into fights, and I realized I needed help, and I sought out a psychiatrist who worked on Saturdays, my day off, and that began a journey that 60 years later to this day continues. And I characterize it in my book as an adventure of a lifetime, and it has been.
Were you an only child?
No, I have a brother who's about 7 years younger, and he pretty much received similar treatment.
Mm-hmm. And how has this resulted in his life? Have you seen kind of the same types of trauma in his life, or did he handle it or react to it differently?
Yes, I definitely have seen the effects of those traumas in his life, primarily in that his life has been very very limited. He's hardly ever left the town we grew up in. Uh, his marriages weren't very successful at all. I really don't see too much emotional intimacy in his life. I mean, I love him. He's a great guy, and the wounds are obvious to anyone who can see, anyone who has some experiences of what trauma is and what it can do in their frame of reference can readily see those effects. My life has been kind of the opposite. I left 2 days after graduation and never lived there again. And, I've been all over. I've lived in various states. I've traveled, spent time in Brazil, New Zealand, Europe. Truly, my life has been an adventure. And we can talk a little more about that later. But for now, suffice it to say that, yeah, there have been big differences.
Mhm. I just asked that because I'm always curious. I believe that trauma, it does affect people differently. And just from my experience of doing this podcast and talking to different people and different experts, it's always interesting to me to see how trauma manifests in different people's lives. And especially with childhood trauma among siblings, how that can be so vastly different between
Yeah.
two people that have had the same experience, yet they've dealt with it differently. So, this is really what inspired you then to get into the line of work that you're in now. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Growing up, mostly I wanted to be a prize fighter when I was an adult. And, once I realized that that wasn't going to be remotely possible, I did not have the qualifications nor the capacity to dedicate myself to grow those qualifications. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had very little interest beyond, sports. And so I just went into the Air Force and began taking classes at the Air Force's University of Maryland's overseas program. And became interested in psychology as I began to realize that I needed assistance and what was it all about. Yeah, that's how I got in.
And how long have you been doing psychology?
Well, undergraduate school, I was 22, so that's 58 years ago.
So you're well versed in the field of psychology, and you probably understand the brain a lot.
Yeah, one of the things that evolved for me was a recognition of the limitations within the field of psychology, primarily the separation of the body from one's psychology. And, it's gradually changing. But when I was first in graduate school, back in the late 60s, the body was never mentioned. And one of the problems with that, Amber, is that trauma affects the whole body. Now, the field has been making progress in that it recognizes the effects of trauma on the brain and the nervous system. And that's a huge step in the right direction. Okay? The next step is to recognize that it affects the whole body, meaning the muscular system, the connective tissue system, uh, the amount of chronic tension throughout the body, the fluid system, even the very fluids of our body are affected by a whole range of trauma. So that's, I came up with 4 components of healing. And the somatic, or one's connection to our body, is the first component that I write about.
And
And that,
this is something that you write about this in your book.
yes. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Uh, so I have a question for you about this book has come up a lot on the podcast. I'm curious your thoughts on this because I'm positive you've probably read it. Is The Body Keeps the Score, where he talks a lot about the effects of trauma on the body and how trauma lives inside of the body. Have you read that book?
Yeah, I've skimmed that book. Yes, I have it right by my bedside.
Mm-hmm.
I look at it from time to time. It's the classic, you know, and it's a very important book in that, again, up until recently, it was all in one psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And Bessel van der Kolk, the author of that book, no, he made it clear that no, it's in the body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was curious your thoughts on his explanation of that because it that book has come up the most on this podcast, and I think that his findings and his research has helped a lot of people. I will say personally, when I read that book, it was an extremely hard read because he goes into depth of some trauma, and I'm an empath, so
Mm.
reading
Mm-hmm.
about trauma is difficult. I mean, even doing this podcast at times gets extremely difficult for me because certain stories and situations, especially when I have guests that go in depth of their trauma, it affects me. Um, but I was curious your thoughts on that because I have a lot of listeners and I have an audience that has dealt with trauma, and I think having an awareness of this, like that it does live in the body and that sometimes feeling those things in the body is not it's not abnormal. It's actually very normal. But could you expound a little bit more on the effects of trauma in the body?
Well, yes. In my case, my body was so constricted that it blocks feeling. It blocks information. So I lived essentially inside my head. And another significant, profound effect of that, when the body is so constricted, when there's so much chronic tension in the body, it has several effects. And one of them is it compromises our capacity to connect with another human being.
Mm.
One of the most beautiful of life's experiences is when we feel love with another human being. And I don't mean that conceptually. I mean the felt sense of, and it can be in moments where we're having a conversation and you just feel love in your heart, and it's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And we need those moments of connection throughout our lifetime. They're essential emotional nutrients. And a constricted, tense body has a harder time feeling that because, again, communication gets compromised. Okay? Another effect is that it sends a signal to the nervous system to be ready to fight or run. Okay? The fight flight response, that tension in the body primes the brain to set off that fight flight response much more readily, so that minor provocations will result in more exaggerated reactions, reactivity. So it's serious. And in a healing process, it's very, very wise to address the body. Now, in my book, I provide some examples of disciplines and practices that can help us. I'm 80 years old, Amber. I'll be 81 in a month. And I'm teaching fluid movement. Continuum is a practice of fluid movement. It's a meditation type movement practice that helps us to reconnect our consciousness with our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
The body.
It's doing you very well, because I would not have thought you were 81. If you're watching on video, you can make your own judgments. But I personally, I mean, you do not look in your 80s at all.
And I teach 40-year-olds, how to connect with the fluidity of their bodies. So yeah, that's certainly one of the rewards of recognizing this, recognizing that we can reconnect. No matter how traumatized we've been, we can reconnect with our deepest selves.
And that's beautiful. I'm thinking, though, as you're talking, that childhood trauma is. Let me back up just a little bit, because I have a question about this. Do you believe that childhood trauma affects people more than, say, trauma that people experience as an adult?
Let me give you an example. I've had 2 clients in the last 20 years who had serious adult trauma. One was a car accident that rendered this woman psychologically incapable of resuming her professional life. Okay? The other was a mugging. My client was fixing a flat tire. 2 guys came up. He thought they were there to help, and they beat the heck out of him and took his money and, like that. Now, both of those people had a robust personality. They had quality upbringing. They were happy people doing their lives, and they were traumatized. They were able to return to their normal life after several sessions of a approach called somatic experiencing, a trauma therapy. Okay? Now, the more common situation occurs when people have a significant amount of trauma and then have an experience like that. That's much more difficult. Okay? So it depends on, what their situation is, what their constitution is, what their history is when that occurs. Childhood trauma is extremely. Well, let me change that. I want to say this a little differently, if I may.
Yes.
I think the great majority of human beings, if not just about all of us, have a certain amount of trauma. It's like it's an ambiguous concept, trauma, because people use it like this. The water cooler at the office wasn't working. What a traumatic day. All the way, that's one extreme, all the way to a wartime trauma where you've witnessed your best friend being shot and, you know, bullets passing your head. And so here's a question that I like to ask people. Were you able to share your deepest feelings with both your parents? If the answer is no, that suggests there was a certain lack of trust. And, that might be minimal, but it's a degree of trauma. I also believe that the reason we are on this earth is to heal, which means to manifest our wholeness. And this is very important, I believe, Amber, that no matter the trauma, mine was quite severe. My childhood, like in a middle class world, you don't see that too much.
Mm-hmm.
The degree of ignorance, the degree of violence, it's associated mostly with slums and tenement buildings and like that, right? And no matter how bad it was, we each have deep within us a spark of light that's never traumatized, that can never be touched by trauma. And sometimes the more serious the trauma, the greater the motivation to not only find that spark, but to cultivate that spark, to grow that spark, to manifest that light. And I believe that the fact that we're primarily in our constitution water, 70% more or less by weight, 99% by number of molecules. Right? We have within us those qualities of water. What are they? Water is one of the most adaptable of substances, resilient, powerful, receptive, soft, humble, washes our feet. We have all those qualities within us waiting for us to manifest.
That is so good. Like, I've never thought of it like that, but that is so good because when I think having that visual comparison is like huge because everything you can think of with water, I can see how it fits into the characteristics of humans. And we're made up of mostly water, which is ironic. I think that's a very great description. When you work with clients, do you bring this up in your teaching with them?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Yes, in one way or another. Either through some of the workshops, continuum workshops that I do, or just through awareness of their bodies. Yeah. So the answer to that question is yes.
Well, this was my next question was how does that fit into the uh continuum? It's called continuum, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
The continuum workflow that you use or that you teach, is that based on those characteristics of like
Yes.
fluidity or water? Mhm.
Yes. That awareness definitely is. Back in the 1960s, a woman by the name of Emily Conrad, who was a dancer and spent a lot of time in Haiti and noticed how much more fluid people were. And realize that, as we've been saying, the body is primarily water. She asked the question, how does water move? If you think about it, how does water move? Not like a machine. See, our model since the Industrial Revolution, our model of the human body is based on a machine or a computer. And recognizing that water doesn't move that way. It moves in waves and spirals and flow. She began inquiring, studying, practicing, and her capacity to move, you know, at 80, or as she approached her 80s. Unfortunately, she passed, but she looked like a teenager moving. It was phenomenal to see this, elderly woman moving like a teenager. And that recognition that we can develop that's at our core. That's who we are. Okay? We're really fluid, resilient, adaptable, powerful, receptive being.
Yeah, that's so good. It also reminds me of this thing of art. I mean, dance and movement. I mean, I see art in everything, but I'm a very artistic, visual, creative person, but I see art in everything. When I got into fitness years ago, I looked at it as art. You know, you're able to shape and mold and sculpt your body in ways
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
you're not doing it with a molding brush, you're doing it with a diet and exercise. But I
Mm-hmm.
found that incredibly intriguing. And then as I got into photography later on, I felt like it was the same way. Being able, even as I'm hearing you talk about the movement and the dance, it reminds me a lot of, this is something I tell clients when I if I photograph them and I notice that someone's having a hard time getting into poses, to almost move like a dancer. And it's amazing the difference that it makes. But I'm only bringing this up because it's amazing to me how much art really fits into that, and how much as humans we truly need art. And I used to not really see the value in it, but I would say over the last several years, I heard someone describe art and describe the power behind art as, we don't normally feel like we need art as humans, but until someone passes away, and then we're looking to music, or we're looking to some type of relaxation, or some type of movement, or all the different things that it has to do. And when I started looking at it like that, I'm like, that it's a gift. It's something that is given to us as humans to lean into. So I think it's beautiful that you've incorporated this, and I would say you're probably one of the only guests that I can remember off the top of my head right now that has kind of incorporated this into the mental health and helping people heal and overcome trauma. So I'm very intrigued about the continuum process. Like,
Mm-hmm.
do people are people like, why are we doing this? Or that ask about the value in doing it? Are they ever skeptical?
Oh, yes. Uh, but first, thank you for bringing art in, because continuum is an art form. It can segue into dance, uh, just the expression of beauty in the movements of the human body. And that too has a healing value, to recognize that our very bodies can express art like that.
Mm.
And yes, to your question about, are people skeptical? And that's why in any continuum event, there's a great deal of time spent establishing a context, an understanding of why we might spend an hour moving our upper lip, or both lips, or our eyes, or our feet. You know? But once you have a concept, once a context, an understanding of what it's about, and it's about reconnecting with ourselves in the deepest possible way. You know, getting our consciousness, our attention underneath the surface.
Mm.
And that corresponds psychologically to the surface of our personality. Because as we're able to quiet the mind, as is one of the objectives of most systems of meditation, as we're able to quiet the mind and go deeper and quieter into our experience, we're starting to tap a different level of our own human beingness.
I'm curious, how did you tap into this way of healing? What first gave you this idea?
That's a story in and of itself, you know. And I was in graduate school, I was very much interested in the work of Sigmund Freud. And Freud had a disciple by the name of Wilhelm Reich. He was a brilliant physician. His peers thought that he would be Freud's primary successor. And he wrote a book that was highly regarded in the field of psychoanalysis. The book was called Character Analysis. And it was about how our way of being in the world was also part of our defensive mechanism. And it was considered a brilliant breakthrough. Some years later, he took another step and he said, you know what? The character of the human being and the body of the human being are functionally identical. That is, you can predict one from the other. And that's when he was considered crazy. I mean, he literally became persona non grata. His work got more and more out there. But in the West, he was the beginning of the conversation that the body is very much related to our personalities, our ways of being. And he said, you have to change the body. Well, by the time that I was reading his work, I had done several years of talk therapy. And I realized it's not enough. It's not enough. I'm still this, frozen character. And then I came across, back in 1971, the work of Dr. Ida Rolf. Have you heard of Dr. Rolf and
Have not.
Rolfing, or structural integration?
I have heard of Rolfing. I have heard of this. This is it's like a form of massage, or a form of breaking down the muscle.
Yeah, it's a form of releasing and lengthening the muscles and essentially balancing the body, improving the overall balance of the body, helping to open it more, like that. And it just spoke to me. And I began receiving sessions, and that was the entryway for me into this whole somatic dimension of healing. And then, I've heard about Continuum, and I witnessed Emily Conrad and Yeah, and I became fascinated by how much growth can happen by addressing the body in one of these systematic ways.
Coupled with this, do you use any pharmaceutical drugs or even any drugs therapies that are on the market or not on the market yet? What are your thoughts with that? Do you agree with using those in combination or not at all?
You're opening a door that can be somewhat controversial for people
Mhm.
with your question, but I'm going to answer you sincerely.
Okay.
That is, I believe that the psychological and spiritual use of psychedelic substances can be a major breakthrough in this field of mental health.
Mhm.
And there's more and more research supporting that assertion.
Mhm.
I've been a member of a Christian church that uses ayahuasca as a sacrament. I've been a member for 30 years. And it's been a great resource, a great support in my own development.
Mhm.
It supported my marriage. That's now in its 40th year. We're both
Congratulations.
in our 80s. We're
Mhm.
very much engaged in our romantic relationship, if you will. Uh, it has emotional depth, deep mutual support, and yet a sense of autonomy.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so I think those substances, for example, psilocybin is being used for, you know, major depression, uh, for helping cancer patients face their mortality. I think their potential is vast, and I think we're going to see that, expand and expand
Mhm.
over the next decades.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I don't know where, I don't know if that was controversial for your show.
We're different people, right? Everybody's different. Everybody experiences trauma different. Everybody manifests that trauma differently. And there's different modalities for healing. So, my heart behind this show is hey, I want people to know there's different modalities for healing. Talking to different experts, there's different experts that's going, like you're going to speak to some of my listeners that maybe the next guest couldn't reach, or vice versa. I love getting other people's thoughts and opinions. I believe this personally for myself. I'm not going to judge anything until I have experienced it. Have I experienced trauma in my life? Yes. Can I speak to things that I've not yet tried to heal that trauma? I can't really speak to that. But my goal here with, controversial or not, I don't shy away from controversy.
I,
But
I admire your openness and your wisdom.
well, thank you. I
Yeah.
wish that all people would approach things that way. The thing that really bothers me the most is there are people hurting in the world that has experienced trauma that I've never experienced. People have experienced the death of children, they've experienced
Mm,
the loss of a spouse, they've experienced seeing a traumatic situation, or like you brought up, being robbed or being hurt or being raped or being whatever.
yes,
People have
yes.
experienced all these things, and I haven't experienced those things. So I can't my heart just hurts for people that have experienced those things. Now, I have certain things in my life that I've experienced that they probably haven't. But
Hmm.
the life, like you said it in the beginning of this, of when we first sat down for this interview, you said it that it's a journey. Life is a
Mm-hmm.
journey. And I also agree with you that we are here to heal. And we're here to not only heal, but to take those things that we've healed from and then inspire and encourage and empower other people through those things. Because
Absolutely.
I know type of the very best consolation I've got in my own life and the things that I've been through in my life is being able to sit down with someone who can understand because they've been through that same type of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I can pair people here, like therapists with people that need that type of therapy, that's my goal. So I'm thank you so much for answering sincerely. And I don't I don't shy away from controversy, none whatsoever. So I'm okay with that. And I've had people come on the show that has specifically, like I had an advocate. She was an advocate for MDMA, and the research and the
Mm-hmm.
governmental like legalization or however what the terminology is for that, but for getting this approved for therapy in the U.S. And I I think if it helps people, why not? Why not try it? The only concern, and I am curious your thoughts about this. Um, the only concern that I would have is that you take someone that maybe they don't go into this type of therapy for the right reasons. They go into it, I think as human nature, let me say this human nature, we have this thing of we want to put a band aid on things. Like we want the fast way out. So my only concern with that is that what if you have someone that goes in that their heart is not truly to heal. It's more to just like, let me feel better in the moment. Let me see if I can experiment with this drug to for the moment, but I don't have an intent to truly heal in the long run. That would be my only concern. But other than that, I think it's a beautiful thing. But do you
Mm.
have thoughts on that?
Yes, they're powerful substances. And I don't recommend that they be used irresponsibly. I don't recommend that adolescents play with them, for example. Not at all, okay?
Mhm.
Because they're very powerful. Uh, it's important that whoever is administering psilocybin, ayahuasca, MDMA, it's important that they're responsible and that they do the proper preparation, the proper guidance, the proper follow through. It's not something to be taken lightly. Now, even with the most professional, the most sincere, competent screening, some people are going to come in to have an experience. That's going to happen, and they usually weed themselves out on their own because you know it's not enough. I mean, taking something can be can be magical sometimes, but usually we've got to do the personal work. They'll facilitate, but they won't do it for us. Okay?
Mhm.
They'll
Mhm.
show us where we need to go, but they won't make us go there.
Mhm. Yeah,
They'll
that's
show
very
us what needs to change, but they
mm,
won't make those changes for us.
mhm.
That said, and I really believe that out of my years of experience, that said, sometimes, I have an example of a good friend who, for decades, you know, 40, 50 years, had a very challenging relationship with her mother. And she believed that it was, her mother's lack of certain qualities that was responsible for their relationship being fraught as it had been.
Mhm.
And in one session, in one experience with ayahuasca, she saw her own contribution to how that relationship was and was able to immediately let go of an attitude that was constantly blocking any possibility of improvement in that relationship. So sometimes one experience will open a big door and you can easily walk through that door.
I think that's awesome when that happens. I and as you're talking, I'm going back in my mind to the things that when you look at things that are acceptable culturally and then the things that are maybe not as acceptable. And sometimes it's very backwards. When you look at, like you said first about having this experience, this traumatic, living under this traumatic experience for the rest of your life versus healing from that traumatic experience. Like, it's the same thing when we think of pain. It's like, do I want to go and have surgery to get rid of the pain, or do I want to live with pain the rest of my life? Like, these are real decisions that people make. So trauma is pain. It's the same. It's not necessarily a physical pain. A lot of times it's an emotional or mental pain, but it's still a pain. So there's that. And then there's the whole idea of medication. I'm shocked by some of the things that the pharmaceutical industry will okay and make acceptable and make legal.
Yeah.
Certain things there shouldn't, in my opinion, shouldn't even be legal and are definitely abused. So, to me, if it's healing and it's helping someone, but as with anything, we have to use things responsibly. As we
Absolutely.
use alcohol, use pain medication, use Tylenol, even, you have to use it responsibly. So I love what you just said. That perfectly put peace in my mind as far as, I don't promote it here, but I definitely don't detour from it either if it's going to help you. So our conversation goes so fast. I feel like sometimes like we're already almost at the hour mark, but let me ask you this. So now you're running this successful practice where you're helping people and you're truly helping people heal. Um, what, how can people learn more about you? How could people find out more about this type of therapy and see that if this is something that's right for them?
Yeah, my website, the purpose of my website is to inform people. I'm not looking for more personal business for myself because, at 81, I'm semi-retired, semi-retired from my practice. So my website, www.pathsofconnection.com, PATHSOFCONNECTION.com. Sorry
We'll
for that
also
long.
put that in the show notes. No. I like for you to say it here because for people that don't look at the show notes, but I also like to put it in the show notes with links
Paths
so you
of
can get there
Connection.
too.
That's it.
Mhm.
Also, my book is very informative about how we get wounded because often people don't have any idea of how much wounding occurred. And one of the challenges there is to acknowledge the wounds at the same time not blame their parents. Okay? That's a big one because people will not look because they're afraid that if they do uncover woundings, they have to blame their parents. Okay, so
Mhm.
that said, my book, if I can put it up here, can you see it?
I can.
Okay.
Healing the
Healing
wounds of
the
childhood and
wounds.
culture.
Yeah, healing the wounds of childhood and culture. An adventure of a lifetime is the subtitle, and it really is. You'll discover wonderful things about yourself on this journey.
Mm-hmm. You're doing such amazing work, and I thank you for, just thinking through this and putting something like this into practice that's truly helping people. If you could leave my guests with kind of like a word of encouragement or kind of final thoughts, what would that be?
Who you really are, that deep inner spark, can never be wounded. It's there, it's whole, it's beautiful, it's lovable. It is lovable. And it's our work to manifest that, to get to know that that's who we are, that we, not the limited selves that we think we are.
Mm-hmm. I love it. I love it. And I think the first step is someone having an awareness that they have trauma. And like you said, sometimes people walk through life, they don't even know they have trauma. They just know they're triggered by stuff. So I think when people can figure that out and then really think through it and get on a journey to heal and to overcome, life can be really beautiful. I mean, we do live in a world that I feel like there's a lot of evil around us, but even in the midst of that, you can still find beauty and peace and joy and all the things, but it does take healing. And you said it takes work on our own part. We have to make a decision to do that work and to dig through that trauma and figure it out and heal from it.
Beautifully said.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I know we had some scheduling things, conflicts, but we got that worked out, and I'm so glad because I think this has been a great conversation, and I really, really appreciate you coming on and sharing all your expertise with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for listening to Through the Trauma podcast. If you have found value in this episode or believe in the mission behind what we are doing, please subscribe so that you never miss any future episodes. Also, be sure to check out our transformation project at transformationthroughtraumaproject.com, where we help inspirational stories get heard on a larger scale through multiple platforms. If you know someone who can benefit from this episode, please share it with them. Until next time.